How do you dismantle a nation's military capability, a shield built and perfected over 4 decades, in just a single rotation of the Earth? We often talk about red lines in geopolitics, the invisible boundaries drawn by superpowers, daring their adversaries to step across. But what does it actually look like when diplomacy finally snaps, when patience evaporates, and a superpower decides to erase those lines completely? Let us delve into the anatomy of Operation Epic Fury, a military campaign that redefined modern warfare, starting with a staggering 1,500 precision strikes within a mere 24 hours. To understand the magnitude of this event, we have to step back and look at the strategic board. For years, the Middle East had been a powder keg of proxy wars, shadow conflicts, and high-stakes nuclear diplomacy. Intelligence agencies, from the CIA to the Mossad, had been watching the steady accumulation of enriched uranium. They tracked the clandestine movements of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or the IRGC, as they fortified their subterranean networks. The strategic objective for Washington and its allies was no longer just containment. The political mandate shifted to eradication, a total neutralization of the threat. But bridging the gap between a political objective and a tactical reality requires a terrifying orchestration of violence and precision. This is how the first week went. The opening phase, the first 24 hours, was designed with a single, uncompromising goal: seize air superiority and execute a decapitation strike against the command and control structures. Let's consider Scenario 1, a traditional aerial bombardment where fighters cross the border, drop their payloads, and hope to evade anti-aircraft fire. That would have been a bloodbath. Iran possessed a highly complex integrated air defense system, a layered web of Russian-made S-300s, indigenous Bavar 373 batteries, and early warning radars that could see deep into the Persian Gulf. So, the planners opted for Scenario 2, blind them, paralyze them, and then break their spine before they even knew they were at war. The silence of the night was shattered not by explosions, but by the invisible dominance of electronic warfare. EA-18G Growlers, operating miles away, flooded the Iranian radar frequencies with white noise. In the operations rooms of the IRGC, radar screens suddenly filled with false targets or went entirely blank. The psychological stress on those young radar operators must have been immense, staring at screens that were supposed to protect their homeland, realizing in that chilling moment that their eyes had been gouged out by an unseen enemy. While the skies were blinded, the sea unleashed its fury. Deep beneath the surface of the Arabian Sea, Ohio-class submarines opened their vertical launch tubes. Arleigh Burke-class destroyers stationed in the Gulf and the Red Sea synchronized their firing systems. In a matter of minutes, hundreds of Tomahawk cruise missiles breached the ocean's surface, painting streaks of fire across the night sky. They flew low, hugging the terrain, navigating through valleys to avoid whatever optical sensors were left. They were headed for the air defense batteries. By the time the first explosion echoed through the mountains, the sky was already saturated with incoming ordnance. But a military is only as effective as the minds that command it. The decapitation phase was arguably the most complex. How did the CIA and Mossad manage to track down the secret compounds of top IRGC commanders and even the heavily fortified bunkers of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei's inner circle? It wasn't just satellites. It was years of agonizingly detailed pattern-of-life analysis, intercepting cellular data, tracking the logistical deliveries of special foods, and monitoring the movements of specific security details. When the command centers were struck, it wasn't with indiscriminate bombing. It was with hyper-precise, low-yield munitions designed to collapse specific structures while leaving adjacent city blocks intact. Within that first 24 hours, 1,500 individual targets were wiped off the map. Airfields were cratered, radar dishes were turned to twisted metal, and command nodes went dark. The sheer volume of the strike was a mathematical necessity to overwhelm the system, ensuring that no defensive missile could find its mark. It was shock and awe, modernized for the 21st century. Here comes week 2. The initial shock had passed, but the reality of war is that the enemy gets a vote. Iran, though blinded and bleeding, still possessed a formidable arsenal of mobile ballistic missiles and a massive fleet of fast attack boats operated by the IRGC Navy. The strategic focus shifted to neutralizing these counterstrike capabilities. The Strait of Hormuz, a 21-mile-wide choke point where 20% of the world's oil flows, became the most dangerous stretch of water on the planet. The tactical engagements here were brutal and incredibly fast. Swarms of Iranian speedboats, armed with heavy machine guns and anti-ship missiles, attempted to break out and harass commercial shipping and naval vessels. But the U.S. Navy had prepared for this exact asymmetric threat. MH-60 Seahawk helicopters and A-10 Warthogs operated in a lethal ballet, engaging the swarms before they could get within striking range. The naval duels were brief but devastating. Simultaneously, the hunt for mobile missile launchers began. This is where the difference between tactical success and strategic victory becomes crucial. Destroying a single missile launcher is a tactical win. But destroying the logistical chain, the fuel depots, and the localized command structures that allow those missiles to be coordinated, that is how you achieve strategic paralysis. Satellites and high-altitude drones scoured the vast deserts and mountainous terrain, looking for the heat signatures of missile engines firing up. When a target was identified, it was eliminated within minutes. The skies belonged entirely to the coalition. But the most daunting challenge remained hidden from view. This brings us to week 3, strategic destruction. For decades, Iran had been burying its most prized assets, its nuclear enrichment facilities and advanced missile assembly plants, deep underground. Facilities like Fordow and Natanz were not just bunkers. They were subterranean fortresses carved into the sides of mountains, protected by layers of solid rock and reinforced concrete. Standard munitions would barely scratch the surface. But what weapon was used to penetrate such unimaginable defenses? Well, they have this bunker buster bomb known as the GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator, or the MOP. It is a terrifying piece of engineering. Weighing 30,000 pounds, it is designed specifically to do the impossible. Only the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber can carry it. Imagine the scene in the cockpit of a B-2, flying thousands of miles from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, slipping undetected through the night sky. The payload drops. The MOP doesn't just explode upon impact. It uses its immense kinetic energy to burrow deep into the earth, cutting through rock and concrete. It is equipped with a smart fuse that counts the layers of resistance it breaches. 1 floor, 2 floors, 3 floors, until it reaches the calculated depth of the subterranean facility. Only then does it detonate, triggering an artificial earthquake that collapses the mountain in on itself. These strikes were devastating, but they also introduced agonizing moral compromises. The planners in Washington knew that hitting these deep facilities ran the risk of geological instability or even the release of radioactive material if the intelligence regarding the contents of those bunkers was slightly off. The decisions made in those sterile situation rooms carried the weight of thousands of lives. The leadership had to constantly weigh the immediate catastrophic human cost against the long-term geopolitical disaster of a nuclear-armed rogue state. It is a burden that changes a person forever. By the time the campaign entered its 4th week, the nature of the war had shifted fundamentally. Week 4 was about sustained dominance and hunting. The major strategic targets were gone. What remained was establishing a relentless battle rhythm. F-22 Raptors and F-35 Lightning IIs maintained constant patrols, completely uncontested. MQ-9 Reaper drones loitered in the skies 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, waiting for any sign of regrouping or resistance. The psychological impact of this sustained pressure on the ground cannot be overstated. Imagine living under a sky that hums with the constant threat of death. For the Iranian leadership that had survived, every step outside a bunker, every radio transmission, every attempt to re-establish control was an invitation for a Hellfire missile. The state apparatus was paralyzed. The military hierarchy was shattered. But as the smoke began to clear, the geopolitical consequences rippled outward, shaking the very foundations of the global order. The global oil markets went into absolute panic. Prices skyrocketed, threatening to plunge the global economy into a deep recession. China, heavily reliant on Middle Eastern oil, watched with intense anxiety, recognizing the terrifying efficiency of the American military apparatus and recalibrating their own timelines for Taiwan. Russia, deeply entangled in its own conflicts, saw an ally decimated, further isolating them on the world stage. Operation Epic Fury was an undeniable tactical masterpiece. The orchestration of 1,500 strikes in 24 hours, followed by a systematic dismantling of a regional power over 4 weeks, showcased a level of conventional military dominance never before seen in human history. They had successfully destroyed the nuclear program. They had dismantled the IRGC's ability to wage conventional war. But as any seasoned geopolitical analyst knows, the destruction of an enemy's military capability rarely equates to lasting peace. The power vacuum left in the wake of the strikes created a terrifying new reality. A nation of over 80 million people was left with a shattered economy, decimated infrastructure, and a deeply traumatized populace. Would this lead to a democratic uprising, as some optimistic policymakers had hoped? Or would it birth a new, decentralized insurgency, more extreme and more volatile than the regime it replaced? The military planners can calculate the trajectory of a Tomahawk missile with pinpoint accuracy. They can engineer a bomb to count the floors of a subterranean bunker. But they cannot engineer the human heart, nor can they calculate the exact trajectory of a nation's grief and anger. The skies over Tehran may be quiet now, patrolled only by the silent wings of American stealth fighters. But down below, in the shadows of the rubble, what new forces are beginning to stir? And when the dust finally settles on Operation Epic Fury, will history remember it as the war that saved the Middle East, or the one that finally broke it beyond repair?